Today, I'm joined by Jon Butler, founder and CEO of Velox, a company that is building the future of front office technology. Jon, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So can you tell us a bit first about your background and what made you launch the company?
Sure, yeah. I myself and the other founders of Velox, our careers, or for the last 20 years, our careers were building, managing, operating sales and trading systems in investment banking, mainly at Goldman Sachs. And that was started that in the late 90s, which was actually pretty fortunate because that was at the point where that was right before kind of the big technological explosion in sales and trading. So I was managing cash equity technology at Goldman through 2000 and 2010, where essentially we went from being 1,000 traders down to 10 traders or 20 traders, and it was all about application of technology. And so pretty much that was our myself and the founders. That was really our careers. Throughout that, it was. I mean, there's a couple of big themes throughout that which led to kind of creating Velox. One was, you can see why it was that way because it's just how kind of capital markets started in the early 90s. But certainly through 2000, you were left thinking, why are we building so much ourselves, right? Why aren't we using the technology industry more, and we're good at investment banking. Are we really going to be as good at building software as well? And certainly as the technology industry started to grow, those other options became more and more viable. And similarly and related, it was just it was just very expensive, very time consuming, to build these systems internally. And they never really, delivered, right? And people were never really completely satisfied with what they got for the money. So both of those things led to Velox. It was, well, we think we can do it with the right tools. If we had the right tools in place, we think people would be able to build things faster, better, more efficiently, and so we created Velox. So Velox is it's a little bit corny, but we describe Velox as the toolkit or the tools that we always wanted but never had. So if I got to do it over again and I was managing, trading technology at Goldman, Velox is the toolkit that I would want, right? So it's just, it's that 20 years of experience kind of boiled down into a platform, using today, right? Using the technologies of today, using the web, using, cloud, using cheap CPU, cheap memory, and, and all the advances that you have in Java and the kind of ecosystem around that.
Wonderful. And we're going to go to that, to the product, the solutions you offer, and to the future. But I just want to stay a bit towards the past. Sure. And can you tell us, so you told us about this great evolution of trading for the past 20 years or so. But can you tell us a bit more about, what were the drivers of the evolutions back then? So like we say today, or the cloud or right. And other stuff. What happened, were there some key elements that really were really milestones?
Right. I think that, there's two drivers, right? There's the drivers on the business side, and then there's the drivers on the technology side. And I think sometimes it was business led and sometimes it was technology led. A lot of it during my period was business led. A lot of it was about electronification. So, a trading desk, making up the numbers for illustration, but let's say in 1999, they traded, 10,000 orders a day or 1,000 orders a day. Mm-hmm. 5 years later, it would be 1 million orders a day, right? Because of algorithmic trading, electronic exchanges, liquidity fragmentation. And so, that drove a whole new generation of technology just to kind of handle that. And so most of certainly my period, certainly through my career, a lot of it was driven that way. And then behind that, you always had that push of, there was always faster computers coming along. You moved out of kind of the Unix world into Windows and Linux. There was always a lot of hardware was constantly being updated. And so, there was always kind of a push pull. The business changing, which would need the need for new systems, and then advances in technology that were cheaper that would then make those systems also be upgraded. But I think most of it was business led, right? And it was just that the business, and this is a lot about why Velox is what it is. The amount of innovation, the amount of change, whether it's the way you and as you sort of your background, right? You're familiar with this. Day in, day out, the markets change, clients change, the regulations change. It's just it's constant change, right? And so, any system to be successful needs to be able to kind of handle that change, efficiently.
Yeah. And is there a time when Wall Street started to really look towards Silicon Valley? And if I was to take a personal example, I remember when I was at Source ETS, that's when a little bit we started discussing it or getting inspiration from there. But I think when I look back then and where we are now, it feels like the cultural shift has been absolutely huge. Basically, technology, I was in sales, and I would never ever talk about technology. That was behind the scenes, etc. I would think now I would think now it's very different, but I'm trying to pinpoint when this mindset change happened.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I think we can thank Steve Jobs for a lot of this because I think the consumer drives a lot of things, and I think when the iPhone came out and people basically had these wonderfully powerful, innovative, futuristic phones, but they're still sitting looking at old trading systems. I think that was really the start of the shift. I think that back to the point I was making earlier, in the beginning, right, in the 90s, banks, capital markets firms built everything themselves because there was no other alternative. They hired the best physicists, they hired the best people out of the science schools, and they built their own databases. SecDB at Goldman Sachs, great example of that. I mean, they built it themselves almost 30 years ago, and that's because there was no other alternative, right? But you look today, so 2001, you had the bubble, you had 9/11, and then slowly through the next 4 or 5 years with what was happening in consumer tech, Silicon Valley emerged, the technology industry really emerged, and viable alternatives started to come up. And so I think popular consciousness, everything became about technology. Everything became about kind of phones, Twitter, social media, the monetization of the internet. And I think banks got dragged into that too. But it's not happened fast enough, right? It's not happening fast enough. And I think that legacy of doing everything yourself, it's taken a long time to shed that, and it's taking too long to shed that, right? And you as you've said in some of my blog posts, it's going to come a point where it's kind of unstoppable force, immovable object. It's just too expensive the way that it's done right now. It's too expensive. It's too inefficient, and there's going to need to be a rapid shift over the next 4 or 5 years where capital markets spend the money that they do have on the things that differentiate them, and they rely on Silicon Valley fintechs, vendors to do the things that are really commodity, and they don't and they really don't differentiate themselves with. I mean, I think you've highlighted one of my quotes, which is, the airline industry was like capital markets, or something like it used to be. They'd all build their own airplanes, and it's an exaggeration, but I think it makes the point pretty clearly.
Yeah, no, I love that quote, because yes, you can imagine a world where you differentiate through building a better plane, but then if you think there's Airbus and Boeing that also subsidize and compete the hell out of each other to build airplanes, it doesn't make sense anymore. So now, I
would make one point, right, which is, and I said I was part of this for 20 years, right, and it's there's one thing knowing everybody knowing what is the right thing to do, right, and where we need to get to. It's another thing to change the kind of culture of a firm, or to get a large organization to kind of make rapid change, and so I think capital markets suffers because of that, because the firms are so big. it's just hard, right? It's hard to do things. It's hard to drive seismic change. And so that's one of the reasons why things have lagged behind. It's not because it's not because there is a lack of people with vision or a lack of people, knowing where they, knowing where they need to go to.
Yeah, sure. So let's try to enter now the current modern day trading room, and try to figure out what are some of the inefficiencies. And I would say, in our culture, in popular imagination, that's what I was looking for. It looks futuristic. So one of the things you mentioned is, there are many screens,
right?
And how is that? So why is that, and how is that a sign of potential inefficiency?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating paradox, and there's a lot of paradoxes in capital markets where, the perception is of really futuristic, really high tech, and the reality is in areas that is true, but then in other areas it isn't. And I think, and I think you said this, right, which is your initial impression when you look at all the screens on a trading floor, it's like, wow. But then really when you look behind the surface of that, it's actually indicative of being quite old fashioned. The number of screens is really just it's just multiple different systems, all do different things, requires a huge amount of real estate. And it's one of those things that, on the face of it, it's like, okay, but then, if you really dig into that and you think about, well, that isn't really helping anybody. If you really think about technology that's going to help you do your job, just putting anything that you might want to see on one massive panel, that's probably the table stakes, right? Really, that's like the basics, right? There's so many other things that you can build on top of that help a trader and help a sales trader be more efficient, right? And so, I think of it as being kind of the multiple screens is data orientated. It's just, let's just get the data out there, right? And that's not really changed for 25 years. What people do, what sales and traders do, is they make decisions all the time, right? And so you move into a future where things are decision driven, and all of a sudden you don't need all this real estate. You need a screen that is basically, much more tuned to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. But it's one of those things that, on the face of it, you look at the screens and you think, well, what's wrong with that? And it's only when you start to scratch, and it's because it's always been that way. It's only when you start to scratch away the surface, you realize that it's really not that helpful.
Yeah, but can you tell us, so specifically, why do people need those screens at the moment? Why would I need to have, well, 2 I can understand, but 6?
Yeah.
What data? You said it was data driven. So what data do I get there?
So you'll have. So it's 2 things. One, it's about wanting to, as quickly as possible, switch context. So I want a risk screen. I want a market data screen. I want a sales screen. I want a CRM screen. I probably want my email. I absolutely, probably my middle screen will be Excel, because that's where I kind of do everything that, that's where I probably spend most of my time doing all the things that the other systems don't do. And the multiple screens is really, what's the fastest way for me to context switch? It's for me to just move my head. I don't want to have to do Control Tab to bring things up to the forefront. It's just the most efficient way to allow people to change context on the fly. And then there's another aspect to it, which is you sit on a trading desk, and you're going to have many different systems that do different things, and they're not really going to talk to each other, right? And so you can't boil things down to single applications and more intuitive workflows, because of this lack of integration. So things stay in this, and that also forces things to stay in this data-driven and data-orientated mode rather than in a kind of decision-orientated mode.
All right. So how does Velox?
But by the way, I mean, I think we've had a very you think about what's happened with COVID over the last 6 months, right? And clearly the world can operate without 12 screens on everybody's desk because nobody had that at home, right? So the multiple screens is a convenience, you know, but it's also a bit of a monument to we just haven't found it. We haven't come up with a better way yet. You know, I mean, by the way, it's also embodied in the blotter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just, you know, ubiquitous, right? Within every sales and trading system, it's a blotter. But when you really think about it, it's a pretty blunt tool. You know, again, data driven. Here's all the data you might need at some point to do something with, right? And that's as far as it goes. It doesn't take you any further than that. And so, you know, that's, I think, the journey that we're on. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot of change over the next 5 years.
All right. And where does Velox come into that? What are the changes that you bring to that environment?
Well, I think that what Velox does is, first and foremost, you know, going back to something that I said before, it's about innovation, you know. And if you kind of, if you want to have a good sales and trading, you know, platform or infrastructure, what are the three things that it's got to get right? One, it's got to be reliable, first and foremost. You know, I mean, you know, you've been in the industry. Things go wrong, it's expensive. It's expensive. Not only is it expensive, it's also, you know, from a regulatory perspective, it can be almost criminal, right? So, I mean, you've got to be reliable, got to be scalable, it's got to be responsive. You've got to be able to deal with, you know, massive fluctuations in volume, but then you've got to be able to innovate, right? You have to be able to move with the times, right? If you look at the challenges that people have today with vendor technology, it's not because the vendors can't build good technology. Absolutely, they can. It just doesn't evolve as the businesses evolve. And so, you know, Velox comes at this primarily from those three angles. You know, in the platform, if you buy the Velox platform, you get the scalability, you get the resilience out of the bat. You don't have to worry about that anymore. But what you get is the ability to innovate. What you also get then is the ability to innovate. Now, we talk about low code. I mean, we're not a traditional no code, low code provider, but what we do is provide a lot of abstractions within our Java libraries that make it as easy as you can to stand up sales and trading tools, systems, applications. So, you know, so it's really those three things. It's about not having to reinvent the wheel. So getting your resilience, getting your scalability, which is kind of 90%, right? And then having that flexibility to be able to then build and adapt your business as time goes by. The other thing that Velox does is our infrastructure is cloud-based and all web and browser-based. All of our functionality is on the server side. None of it is on the desktop. So the other thing that we do for clients is, you know, the first implementation with Velox will be really kind of a similar workflow to today, which is purely manual. But what we do is we make it very, very easy to turn this, to go from one side of the spectrum of kind of manual to a more automated side of the spectrum. So built into Velox is this notion of we call it aggregate, analyze, act, and you can, in the beginning, that can be quite manual, but basically we allow you to turn the dial at a time. So as a business, you can go, you know, over 2-3 years, you can suddenly start to move the needle to being much more automated. There'll always be humans in the loop, but it makes it very easy to start to automate away a lot of the manual, repetitive stuff that clogs up people's day-to-day. You know, I think, you know, one thing we say is we want to stop front office operating and get them back to generating revenue, right? Because I think at the moment the balance is wrong.
All right. Yeah. No, that's a very good comparison as well. So it's definitely not about having one more vendor, and vendors have been characterizing, I guess, the evolution of the last year. It's about a platform where you could potentially also, well, at least you can integrate the functions and maybe the vendors as well.
Yeah. So we, we like to think of ourselves as, you know, in the past there was two choices, right? You built it yourself or you bought it from a vendor. We like to be the best of both. We talk about ourselves as being the best of both worlds. So you get to buy the things that you should buy, but then you retain the ability to build the things that you need to build. We're quite practical in the way that we're thinking about it, because whenever you talk to a client, there is an existing infrastructure already in place. And that can be vendor technology, it can be probably a mixture. And one thing we do is we can sit on top of the existing infrastructure. And so, you know, we'll find a lot of firms that struggle to innovate because they have old legacy systems.
Mm-hmm.
Velox puts a fabric on top of that, which then allows you to, I would say, get the most out of your existing products, but then opens up that ability that gives you that agility and that ability to innovate going forwards as well. So we're not just another vendor. We're not trying to replace vendors. Mm-hmm. We're providing something in addition to that.
Yeah, no, and that's the famous legacy system. How do you move it? And so, if I understand well, the question is, well, you don't try to remove the whole base,
right?
But if you build an interface, a platform on top of it, that's easily
exactly.
Then you can.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I can speak from very personal experience of trying to switch things off, and it's incredibly hard. And so, you know, what we preach is about, you know, in the first instance, do something that allows you to innovate, right? And start to move forward again and start to build a kind of a more futuristic front office. And don't put that work at the end of kind of a legacy elimination project, because you might never get there.
Yeah. And
one thing I would say though, just one point that I didn't mention before, is in terms of the future, I do believe that, and Velox is aimed at that. And actually, I had a lot of experience at Goldman with a system called SecDB, which I think was really a forerunner in this, which was about enabling people on the desk to technical people on the desk to build products on the fly and build functionality on the fly. I think that trend continues over time. I think sales traders become more and more technical. And, you know, Velox is what SecDB did was much more in the derivatives OTC space. You know, Velox is doing a similar type of thing, but in sales and trading, where, you know, you're giving this toolkit, which is a sandbox, if you like. Mm-hmm. Instead of Excel, you're able to build proper apps very, very rapidly whilst sitting on the trading desk. And I think that's how the skill sets will change over time, and already have. I mean, if I think about my career and who was running businesses, you know, back in 1999 versus who runs businesses today, I mean, there's just been a massive transition towards a balanced economic and kind of science technology background.
Yeah, and even when you say low code, no code, and we're heading to it. So it's not about the future of a drag and drop in sales and trading function.
Yeah.
It's a
and I think that I mean, and we love that. In every technologist, I think, is fascinated by that. And I think in certain aspects of the investment bank, I think it's incredibly applicable. We think though with sales and trading, it's so specialized, and so the details are so important. Yeah. You're dealing with a lot of high volume, high resilience. We think that you're still going to be you're still going to have developers, people with development skills that are going to be constructing the apps.
Mm-hmm. And may I ask as well, who are your customers then, or the type of customers you mainly deal with?
Actually, I mean, it's a blend. Investment banks, and brokers and market makers, and a couple of fintech firms, similar to ourselves. But our product is one of the great things about our architecture. And again, this all comes from the learnings. Learning the hard way over our careers is our product is generic. So in some respects, although we're an application platform and we're not a database, if you think about Oracle, for instance, when you get Oracle can do anything. You just give it the schema and it can do, it'll adopt whatever domain you want it to adopt. Velox works in the same way, right? Which is it's all schema driven. Build time, we generate the Java code automatically. So it really gives you that huge amount of it really gives you that flexibility and that ability to adapt. And so that means our kind of aperture is can be quite wide in terms of the different clients, different types of problems that we can tackle.
All right, and in terms of your marketing and growth, I assume that you deal with multiple stakeholders at your counterpart or your clients. What would you say is the main challenges that you're facing in terms of that, in terms of marketing? And is it a very complex process? The buying?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I think that so it really depends on the size of the client. But some of the bigger accounts, it's a long sales cycle. It's and again, speaking from personal experience, I mean, you really can't underestimate the change in capital markets firms from 20 years ago, right? And with what happened in 2008, with regulation, with paranoia about rogue trading, and so a process which was already long because of multiple stakeholders, multiple decisions, hard to make decisions in large firms. It's now, there's then the vendor onboarding process. All these things are incredibly long-winded at large firms. The smaller firms are much more nimble. And I think, again, it's one of those things that, it just has to change, and I think certainly I was seeing those changes at Goldman where, people just recognized that it was just not commercial, and in a technology driven world that was evolving all the time, they just needed to get the process to be simpler. And I think some firms are doing a better job of that. Large investment banks are doing a better job of that than some others. But.
Mm-hmm. And to dig a little bit more into the marketing before then really trying to talk about the future and what it looks like. I see you're obviously posting a lot of articles, very interesting articles yourself. So how, and I don't know about the rest of the company, but how important is that, the content marketing side of things? How does it help in this complex cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hugely important. I mean, I think that, I guess the way I think about it is, where does the sales process start? And where does the sales process start? And so now, you couldn't do this 10 years ago, but now, if a client looks at us, what they're going to do is they're going to look on the website, and then they're going to look on LinkedIn, right? And websites are relatively one-dimensional. Demos are kind of one-dimensional too. I think being able to read articles, it gives. And you could argue that it's better off as a video blog. It's an extra dimension, but certainly, if the website and demos are one-dimensional, I think then the blog posts, the articles, I think gives a second dimension, right? And so people clients begin to form a mental picture of what you do and what you're about and how you're thinking. I think that, and so that's beginning the sales process. And so what we find then is when we actually start to engage with the client, they've already done some selection. They really do understand what we're about. And it's a more qualified conversation, and it's just a more, you can kind of get down to it quicker. I also think that, for fintechs, right, building trust with clients is hugely important. We're not, none of the fintechs have a 20-year-old track record by definition, or certainly very few. And so I think building trust with clients is really, really important. And I think the blog posts and the articles help with that as well, because I think it gives a more personal insight into what we're about. So I don't post about anything that I wouldn't want a client to read. I try to post things that, if they had time, it would be great. I think it would be value added if a client read, what we were writing about.
Yeah, no, but I really like your approach. I found it particularly interesting for me. One of the articles that I'm going to ask you a few questions about is how front-office technology might look in 10 years' time, which is really not talking about, what the technology is today and what the details are, etc. But okay, a bigger vision of the future. And so let's go a bit deeper into that. So you mentioned here a few critical elements for that. So could you let's say, go quickly through them? So for example, you say reference data, and that's an obvious one, that you need data.
Yeah.
But how will that change in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that the particular post that you're referencing. I mean, I guess there's two, and it's an interesting exercise in writing it and distilling. Generally when I sit down and write the blog post, it's kind of a journey, of kind of just like thought collection, and this was meant to be quite realistic rather than, AI and quantum computing. And it was meant to be kind of a practical approach to what will happen in 10 years. And the big thing that needs to happen, and the thing that will drive the most, benefit, is really cleaning up, some of the problems of the past, right? And problems that are driven through just rapid growth and rapid evolution, and just areas of the market which just have not been that have just not been optimized, and they're still quite dysfunctional, right? And so data is one, data being one of them. I mean, if you sit on a trading desk, I don't know if you had this experience, there's no canonical single reference source for product data, right? There's multiple different providers. When it comes to corporate actions and things of that nature, I mean, the quality of the data is always questionable, and so there's so much complexity that's built into systems to just deal with the fact that the data could be wrong. So I think things like that, resolving those will a lot of that, it's about shifting complexity, right? And shifting who's solving the problem. At the moment, the complexity sits with capital markets, and everybody solves the same problem independently. Data being one of them. I think that, in 10 years time, that gets resolved, right? So, and there's a number of things like that through that's a theme that goes through this post. Another thing around connectivity, around order management systems, the movement of there's a lack of, I guess another analogy I use is, if you think about Facebook, right? And you think about, that type of social media, you don't have to build your own, you don't all build your own kind of internal Facebook to communicate with other people's internal Facebooks, right? It just exists once, and everybody puts their content into it, and then put their apps into it, right? And that's where I think we will end up going to, with capital markets, where things like order management, things like connectivity, things that everybody does themselves, which are really don't differentiate, that gets moved centrally. And the net effect of all of this is, you give back in terms of tech spend, you give back kind of a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of kind of investment back to the capital market firms, so they can start to innovate. Right, and so they can start to drive more futuristic kind of functionality.
One of the things you mentioned, and I thought about it when talking about data. I remember in the early days when I was trading spot FX, and I had the data feed in an Excel spreadsheet that would freeze very often, and I would have completely off. But that aside, which is really antiquated. The Excel is still there, right?
Yeah,
you mentioned as well the chain, so it's still there, and I don't know when it was invented, but it's decades ago, and it's still probably one of the favorite tools. So tell us a little bit. You also mentioned about the roles, how they're evolving, and how maybe the role of Excel itself will decrease.
Yeah, and I think Excel is one of those things that is victim. It's almost the perfect definition of a victim of its own success, right? And it's one of the most successful pieces of software ever written, and so flexible as a sandbox, and it's almost been, because of the problems with legacy technology and the need to innovate really quickly. Excel has become the kind of plug, right? It's become the kind of buffer, and so to your point, there's so many spreadsheets that are becoming incredibly complicated that really are just fundamentally important to the business. And I think that, to the point now where there's real operational risk around those. And I think what you will see, but there's something right about it, right? It's wrong to say, well, we'll just get rid of it, right? What we'll actually do is use Excel for what it's meant to be used for and what it's good at, and provide a better, more structured sandbox type environment, which is, I think, more part and parcel of the sales and trading system. And so people are still able to innovate. Sales and front office is still able to innovate, and they're still able to do that kind of what if analysis, but they're doing it within a proper software engineering environment, right? So that you're not relying on you can audit it, right? If cells get updated, you can keep track of that. You can roll it back. You can roll back versions. You don't end up with this kind of, we've updated Windows and nothing works anymore, right? So I think it's the right idea. Excel is given people, it's the right thing people need to be doing. It just needs to be done now in a more structured, operationally sound way. Right. But I think it goes back to what we were saying before, right? Which is the grid and data, being data orientated. I think that hopefully, what I imagine is going to happen is we become more decision orientated, right? And the systems become more decision orientated. So I actually think that the type of innovation that needs to happen on the fly, I think that will also become a higher level type of innovation. Whereas Excel, it's just data. You've got the data, go do something with it. I think, now the kind of the equivalent in 10 years time, it'll be richer. It'll be, well, I want this real-time analysis or this real-time signal to allow me to make better decisions. And I'm able to kind of play around with that, back test it, see how it charts, and then put it into production and have it integrated into my trading system. And so have that kind of thing, really, really easy to do.
So that's what the future could, sorry, yes, go ahead.
But I think that, I said, I just didn't go into the post, right, about how kind of the business necessarily will change. Because I don't know, I'm assuming that the way people make money and the fundamental concepts will remain the same. So it's really about it's making it easier to follow the sales and trading processes that happen today. It's just making them more efficient, making them easier to do, making them safer. And rather than just, a complete radical change in direction.
Mm-hmm. So more efficient, safer, and rather than going through data to then take decisions, well, the decision tools are probably closer to your eyes or right in front of your eyes.
Yeah. I mean, it's more of a, instead of, the way I like to think of it is, and again, it's a simplified case, but if you look at what people do over a day, there's a lot of repetition, right? And you can break it down into something happens, right? I decide what to do, and then I do it, right? And there's a chunk of those that fit into a pattern that happen all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's quite easy to imagine a system where you can set up those, it's like your email rules, right? As a simplified example, you can imagine it's quite easy to take a lot of what you do and have the system essentially say, that thing you wanted to know about and that thing you wanted to do, right? It pops up, it gives you, this is what you should do. This is why you should do it. Do you want to do it? And there's a button there, right? So that is much more decision driven rather than data driven.
Great. So that paints a picture of the future. To finish off, maybe could I just ask, would you have any tips for firms that want to, legacy firms that potentially want to embrace this innovation and trying to change the way they do?
Other than talk to Velox.
Yeah, or generally speaking, what's the right approach? So obviously, how should they go about it?
Yeah, I'm
a more top level thing. Talk to Velox.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? I mean, I think one of the problems of capital markets firms or banks or trading organizations is that that's what they're good at. They're good at trading, right? The management structure, the decision making structure is based around the business, right? And so I think that when we talk about innovation, generally speaking, we're talking about technology, right? We're talking about becoming, and I think, Lloyd Blankfein, when I was at Goldman, and the CEO said, Goldman is now a technology firm, right? And that's that's really what the advice is you've got to, whether it's just at the trading desk level or whether it's at the business, whether it's at the divisional level, if you want to get really, really good at innovating, then you have to think about, well, how do I have a part of my business that works like a technology firm, right? And makes decisions like a technology firm. And somehow, which, business decisions generally can be made very quickly. Technology decisions, it's harder to do, right? Because there is, writing good software takes time, right? And so there's just a different, there's a different mindset, there's a different set of rules and a different set of principles, and it's about adopting those, right, and fusing them into your business, fusing them into kind of the fabric of the business, and then, as what we've seen, like within the leadership space, then the leaders of those businesses need to embody those two skills as well, right? And as much as is possible, you would want people who are running businesses that have written code, right, that understand, some of the things that aren't obvious, right? I spent a lot of my time, a lot of my career, having conversations about why it seems so hard. And, there's always this preconceived notion that
Mm-hmm.
it should be easy to build software. And which was, my point was always, well, why should it be easy? But there was always, and the thing is, it's only when you spend time as a developer that you realize, when you really get into the details of it, you realize why it's hard, right? And why it's time consuming. And so I think having those skills and that knowledge and that awareness within the leadership is incredibly important.
Yeah, that's also comes back then to the case of business education in general, including a bit of tech, including a bit of fintech as well, because I think now when you talk about finance, eventually you talk about, well, fintech, and therefore for the business decision makers of the future, the curriculum would have to then. It reminds me of a conversation that I had with someone else on the podcast, Henry Lyman, but we're not going to have time to go deeper into that, and maybe a separate podcast. So yeah, maybe just last question before we finish, Jon, but it's been really great. I see you got 3 locations: China, yep. Shanghai, London, New York. I think New York is home, but which one are you the most excited to visit? Do you have a preferred one?
Shanghai for sure.
All right.
But we're actually going to do our annual get together. Well, forgetting about COVID for the time being, but that's where we were going to do our next kind of annual get together would be in Shanghai. We've all been in capital markets for many years, so with the major hubs we've all visited many times. I think Shanghai is an exciting venue for us.
Yeah, I was talking again in a previous conversation. People talk about Wall Street and Silicon Valley, but Henry was saying, look east, because in the fintech space, this is where it's happening, right?
Yeah,
so you're already there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a great business opportunity. I think that obviously, the major hubs in the US and in the UK, there's a lot that certainly the Chinese businesses and Chinese entrepreneurs are trying to learn and catch up. And so there's if you can geographically and culturally get that into your company, there's huge opportunity there.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, Dan. It's been really great talking to you, and all the best to you and the Velox team.
You're welcome. Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks a lot.